Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
Kirsty Williams served for 22 years in the Senedd, representing Brecon and Radnor. For much of that time, she was leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats, the first woman to lead one of the four main political parties in Wales. Between 2016 and 2021, she was Minister for Education, leading a national mission of education reform. She retired from frontline politics in May 2021 and now chairs the advisory board of the International Learning Exchange Programme, Wales' replacement for Erasmus+, and a member of the Welsh Government's Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. Kirsty joins myself and Richard Martin tonight to reflect on her time at the top table of Welsh politics and the state of Wales in these turbulent times. Good evening, Kirsty.
Good evening, Shmai.
We invited you on tonight to talk all things Brecon and Radnor, the beating heart of Welsh politics. But really, they say a week is a long time in politics, and what a week we have just had. You haven't been asked to join us to talk about Westminster, but we can't let the recent week's events pass without comment. Have you got a take you want to share with us on what you've seen in the past week and what we can expect?
Well, I think everybody would agree that what we have witnessed is quite extraordinary. The future is very uncertain. And for me, whilst some observers and some practitioners might see that this leads to a political advantage for their particular point of view, what worries me the most is that this is a further nail in the coffin of the concept of trust between voters and their politicians, and actually damages the relationship between those that are governed and those that seek to govern. And that's got to be bad for politics of all colours and all stripes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good take. I don't think it was a high level of trust even before the past week, but we're certainly plumbing new depths. Where do you think this current chaos began? Do you think it was 2016 and Brexit, or is it a far more recent development with the characters we've got at frontline politics at the moment?
Undoubtedly, the referendum on the membership of the European Union certainly has unleashed something in UK politics. But I think perhaps what that overshadowed was deep divisions across political divide, actually, about attitudes towards the European Union. Clearly within the Conservative Party, a view of wanting to leave, but fault on behalf of other political parties. You know, as someone that was obviously heavily involved in Liberal Democrat politics, a failure on our behalf to continue to make the case for membership of the European Union for many, 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 many years. So, you know, not making it, you know, a core part publicly of our campaigning, something that we believed in, but we believed in it quietly until perhaps it was too late to advocate for those views. I think it also demonstrates as well that for all political parties, they're a broad church. They contain, you know, people with with different views even within a political party, and from time to time, you know, those divisions within political parties become untenable. And perhaps the governing party finds itself in that situation in the way other political parties have found themselves in that trouble, you know, throughout their history. So, but I think, as I said, for me, the consequences are, I believe, a further division between, as I said, the electorate and those that seek to govern. And I think it'll lead to less people wanting to participate in politics, either as practitioners themselves or as people who actually go out to vote because they think the voting will make a fundamental difference to their lives.
I think that's exactly it, and it's really nice to have that kind of honesty on where the Leave campaign, the Remain campaign was really. But that's enough about Westminster and Brexit. So if we go back to the Senedd, and you served from the start of the Senedd, right from the very beginning of devolution. I think you were even pre that part, and you were part of the advisory committee on establishing the Assembly as it was then. How did that come about, and how did the little Nettley girl end up serving the constituents of Brecon and Radnor?
Oh my goodness. Well, it's probably a very long and boring tale to most people, but I joined the precursor of the Liberal Democrats back in school, and perhaps it all lays at the feet of my history and politics teacher at my school in Llanelli. And the first lesson we did in my politics A-level was on electoral systems. And I thought to myself, well, this is a terrible way to go about electing a government. And then the second lesson that we did was on the House of Lords, and I was even more outraged about how an unelected chamber could be part of a government. So I guess that's where it started for me. Ending up a member of the National Assembly Advisory Group, again, was a massive shock. You know, I was involved in the referendum campaign, out and about, delivering leaflets, you know, going to events, speaking at events, very active in that. And during that time, I was asked to make a short film for the BBC on why people should vote yes. And during the process of making that film, I met Ron Davies, the then Secretary of State for Wales. And after the referendum, I received a phone call in work from Ron Davies' special advisor to tell me that the Secretary of State was going to ring me later that afternoon and to invite me to be a member of the National Assembly Advisory Group. And initially I thought it was a prank. I thought somebody was pranking me, but that call did come and I was, you know, thrilled and delighted. My party at that time was less thrilled and delighted. And in fact, they approached Ron Davies and said, no, you can't have her. You have to have this person. And fair play to Ron Davies. He said, well, you either have her or you have nobody at all. So I was very fortunate to have that opportunity, and then from that moment on was just determined to play a part in that National Assembly for Wales, and made an application to be the candidate in Brecon and Radnor. I remember being very, very earnest and travelling up to Westminster to inform the then MP for Brecon and Radnor it was my intention to seek the nomination. And he turned to me and he said, oh, you don't want to do that, dear. And I said, why wouldn't I want to do that? And he said, oh, no. We've already decided who the candidate for Brecon and Radnor should be. And I was outraged because I said, well, you haven't gone through the process. And he said, no, but we know who the candidate is going to be. Why don't you go to Bridgend? He said. And I said, why would I want to go to Bridgend? And he said, oh, I think you could do very well in Bridgend. And I said, I'm going to lose in Bridgend. And I don't want to lose. So as it turned out, armed with a significant number of ordnance survey maps and a membership list and the goodwill of the Liberal Democrat members of Brecon and Radnor, I was successful in gaining that nomination. And that was the beginning of an amazing 20 plus years of service at the Assembly, latterly the Senedd. And I'm very fortunate, very, very fortunate to have had that opportunity.
Kerry and I are racking our brains now. Political knowledge doesn't go that deep. We're trying to figure out who the MPs are in these circumstances.
It was Richard Livesey was the MP at the time.
Wow. Okay. I mean, you touched on Ron Davies there. What was your interpretation at the time? Because he was juggling a very complicated party process within the Labour Party and obviously reaching out to other parties itself wasn't particularly popular among parts of the Labour Party at the time as well. So, you know, at the time, what were your kind of impressions of that process and how it was coming about? Did it feel momentous, or did it feel like it was just something that the Labour Party was going through the motions of? I'm kind of curious because you were kind of integral, but also a little bit of an outsider from a different political party.
Sure. So I don't think, as you said, we should underestimate the difficulties that Ron Davies had in delivering, first of all, you know, delivering a referendum. I mean, if you look back on the papers now, you know, Blair wins in 97, and there is an absolute groundswell in that administration not to touch constitutional reform with a barge pole. You know, I think there are papers, aren't there, with Jack Straw saying, you know, we haven't waited this many years to have a Labour government for you then to faff around with constitutional reform, and you could leave it to later in the Parliament. And I think, you know, it would never have happened if it had been left to later in that particular Parliament. So, you know, I just think you have to give credit where credit is due, is that, you know, Blair made good on those commitments. But as always, in the story of devolution, I think it's fair to say devolution only moves as quickly as the Labour Party is prepared to move. But that's about the politics, the art of the possible, isn't it? And you should never let perfect be the enemy of the good. And, you know, I've certainly, and others across the political spectrum, that were in favour of devolution. This was the beginning of a step forward that would hopefully then build some momentum. And I think Ron Davies, had a very difficult juggling act to manage his own MPs, as well as then the expectations of those of us that wanted to push further and faster. But those discussions, were fascinating to be a part of. And of course, actually, our recommendations didn't stand the test of time because, the advisory group alongside Ron Davies came up with this idea of a corporate body. And of course, when it came to the practicalities of delivering on devolution, that corporate body was found wanting in different ways and didn't stand the test of time.
We forget now, over 20 years ago, but it's the first few years were a little bit turbulent, and it really did take the Lib Dems coming into coalition in that first assembly to give a bit of stability into early Labour, a little bit of I'm not saying infighting, but the Alan Michael to Roger Morgan handover. It wasn't an auspicious start until that first coalition really took the rest of the assembly forward. Have you got any memories of that first coalition?
Well, I think you're right. I think we were all very conscious that we had to demonstrate to everybody in Wales, but particularly the near majority of people who hadn't wanted the institution to be established in the first place, that it was worth having. And I guess, we're back to the watchword of this last week, aren't we, about instability and what instability communicates to members of the public. And that was certainly part at the forefront of Liberal Democrat minds when we were thinking about whether to join that coalition or not. And I think, there is also another point, there's another Rubicon that sometimes happens in politics, is that at some point, the public or your colleagues just stop listening. And that happened to John Major after the Black Wednesday. I think you could point to that to Gordon Brown when he called off the election that never was. Certainly happened to the Liberal Democrats after tuition fees. It doesn't matter what happens after that point. The public has just stopped listening to you. They're not prepared, to give you their ear. And I think, a point had been reached at that particular moment for the then leadership of Ali Michael, where that was a real danger point for the future of that institution, a real danger point. And I'm very glad that the Welsh Liberal Democrats played their part at that moment of providing that stable government going forward in that crucial first term.
Yeah, I think it was very much needed. It was very different times, and I think history will reflect on that stability was really needed during that handover period. The second assembly term, it was a Labour majority. You eventually became leader late in the noughties, and then were involved in one of Welsh politics, Welsh devolution's most intriguing episodes, the possibility of a rainbow coalition or not. We are going back into the past here, but it's interesting. You're such a you've been throughout devolution, so you've got the knowledge on these periods, and you were involved in the rainbow coalition or not. Can you talk us through what happened there? What might have happened?
If you don't mind me saying, you've kind of got your dates mixed up. So I wasn't a leader at that point when the Rainbow Coalition was a possibility. I think for me, it is first of all about the ability to provide stable government and a government that will be able to act and do things to improve the lives of people of Wales. And I think the important thing to note about party collaboration, the stuff that you can agree on paper, and the programmes of governments or the progressive agreements, whatever title parties come up with, that's the easy bit. The fact that you've been able to get them down on a piece of paper demonstrates to you that that's the easy bit. The hard bit, the stuff that you can't agree on, is left out, and people hope that somehow at some point those issues will be addressed. And you certainly can't take into consideration events. So you can't plan ahead, for what might, unfold during the term of that office. And I think to be able to provide stable government in those circumstances, you have to have a basis of at least a shared set of values. If you think of a Venn diagram, a reasonable crossover of a shared set of values and instinctively how you might approach trouble when trouble comes, and inevitably trouble does come. And I just felt that the Rainbow Coalition, which looked to marry the values of Plaid Cymru, the values of the Welsh Liberal Democrats, and the values of the Conservative Party, were not one would be able to provide that stable, impactful government for that term, and subsequently voted in the way that I did. In doing so, I did so not in the belief for a moment that that would mean that it did not progress, but I felt at that time it was the only thing that I felt was the right thing to do. There was enough people that shared my view, and obviously Plaid Cymru and the Labour Party made then a different decision. But I stand by that, and I don't have any regrets.
If someone were to walk into the Senedd chamber tomorrow and suggest that the Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru, and the Conservatives should form a government together, they'd be laughed out of the room. It's quite extraordinary to think how much has changed in the time since that. You know, what is probably the great sliding doors moment in devolution, that period. I mean, people still talk about it, both from the Conservative and Plaid Cymru sides and Liberal Democrat sides, but also the Labour Party are very fond of reminding people that there was nearly a rainbow coalition because it proves a useful campaigning tool. Just wondering how you kind of reflect on that idea of parties that wouldn't naturally come together, being able to come together, because you've played a part in so many of these, actually, these moments where not only there was the Rainbow Coalition and the early days of the Senedd, but also then you were representing Wales during the Lib Dem Conservative Coalition in Westminster. And I remember you talking to Walescast last year, I think it was, quite clearly about your opinions on that. But of course, you know, even as we are now, you know, we've had various kind of peculiar quasi coalitions from Welsh governments to keep their agenda alive. And I'm just wondering, you know, kind of how you feel almost like the atmosphere or the appetite is for that, and why perhaps we seem to find it easier in Scotland and Wales, although not so much recently in Scotland, but it seems to still be incredibly toxic in Westminster to do that kind of cross-party thing.
Well, first of all, I would say you're right. You know, in many ways, people would look at a rainbow coalition in the current setup and think that was very unlikely. But actually, it's not that long ago, in 2016, when people were criticising me for, you know, the fact that there could have been a Leanne Wood, UKIP, Tory kind of deal, which is even more extraordinary, I think, personally, at that particular moment. You know, but, you know, that's even pushing it even further, isn't it? About having that Venn diagram where you can have a crossover of certain values and approaches to life. So it's not that long ago, really, when you think about it. But I think what's the difference? I think necessity is the difference. The way the electoral system works in Wales, you know, is that it has created that necessity and that mindset where political parties do have to think about working in a different way. Otherwise, you know, the Labour Party wouldn't have been able to stay in power or wouldn't be able to move forward on its agenda. Whereas, of course, that's not the case in Westminster. I mean, you think, don't you, about 97 and the Blair-Ashdown discussions prior to 97, and the fact that there was some, you know, they talked privately about what an administration, what a government might look like, the role the Liberal Democrats may or may not play in that. But when it came to it, the majority was so big, Tony Blair didn't need to pick up the phone to Paddy Ashton at all. And, you know, all of those careful discussions beforehand were, you know, went out the window because the necessity wasn't there. So I think that's the difference, really, is that, you know, the electorate system and the electorate have sent Seneds back that have necessitated the need for political parties to work in that way. And I think that's the key difference, which we'll see if there was ever a change in the electoral system at Westminster, whether that culture would develop. Who knows?
That if was doing an awful lot of heavy lifting in that sense. I can't believe I'd forgotten about the 2016. Again, I know the team at Walescast asked you a lot about that. But just before Kerry picks up, I'm sure he's going to want to ask you about your time in government any moment now. But how do you reflect on that 2016 moment? Because you were literally, this is again, you were right at a sliding doors moment in Welsh politics. If you'd been ill that day or you'd not been present in the chamber, it would have been a very, very, very different Senedd term. How do you look back on that now? Do you think it was a mistake by Plaid Cymru to even get into that position, or do you think that was just, it was fair game? They were trying to kind of seize control in a way of the agenda in the Senedd at the start of that Senedd term.
I don't think it was a mistake. I think there is a very logical, rationale and intent behind that. But it's really interesting. Somebody liked a tweet that I had tweeted at the time just last week. So somebody must be clearly, I don't know, crawling back through my Twitter feed. And, I just did not think that proposition offered one of stable government. And if you're a proponent of proportional representation, I think it's incumbent upon you then to look at cooperating, working with other political parties to provide government. And I don't think anybody would thank you for walking away from those responsibilities. And I've spent a lot of time in the last week or so thinking about that meeting in London that discussed whether the Liberal Democrats should join a coalition with the Tories at that time. And as you say, I've never been particularly shy about talking about my severe misgivings about that time, probably the toughest time of my political life. But the irony is that morning we spent a huge amount of time, because of course, if you remember, we were in an economic crisis at that particular time in British history, and we spent, and I'm sure people will say that I'm making it up, but I can assure you, we spent a huge amount of time that morning discussing what would happen to the markets if there was not a stable government. And would we be blamed as a party that, having had this opportunity to form a stable government, we would walk away and throw the economy to the markets, and what that would mean for people's mortgage rates? I mean, it seems absolutely ironic to me, but, we spent a lot of time that morning thinking about those kinds of issues and the responsibilities that, sometimes land at your feet. And the question is whether you pick them up and you act, or whether you walk away. And certainly walking away is the easiest thing to do. I've learned that. I spent a lot of time on those opposition benches, and I've spent time actively myself being part of the government or having to support a government. And I can tell you opposition is a lot easier.
I think we have all forgotten, obviously you haven't, Kirsty, but I think a lot of us have forgotten the UKIP years in the Senedd, difficult times. But that Rainbow Coalition aside now, that didn't happen. I think it was an intriguing part of the devolution process, and as Rich said, it's unthinkable to happen at the moment. But the Welsh Lib Dems didn't go into that particular coalition, but then a few years later, the UK level of Liberal Democrats went into coalition with the Conservatives in Westminster. Can you reflect on that decision now? And, it provided the stability we just talked about, obviously, but it also, I think it's fair to say, it did harm the Lib Dems as a political force across the UK, which they're still rebuilding on.
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think, firstly, a lot of Lib Dem voters simply could not reconcile themselves with their vote then leading to that decision. And I think if a political party does something which a lot of voters think is a vote fast on what they were promising in the election, I think that is very, very challenging to overcome. But I think there was probably enough people that were willing to, that were understanding enough to think that, yeah, we needed a government and would give us the benefit of the doubt for stepping out. But then I think, some of the decisions that were made in that government simply led to a situation where people were not willing to listen to anything the Liberal Democrats had to say. And I think, obviously tuition fees was absolutely that moment where we had been absolutely clear about what we said before the election, and then did something absolutely contrary to that. And that was hugely, hugely damaging. I mean, there were lots of other things I'm sure that people would point to, but I think, that one particular decision, I just think that one of the challenges for smaller parties and coalitions, and I'm still not convinced that any political party has cracked it yet, either in the experience in Scotland, when there have been coalitions since the beginning of devolution, obviously not so much recently, but the coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and indeed coalitions in the Senedd, is how do you, from a party political perspective, how do you survive that experience? Not only how do you survive it and not get absolutely hammered like the Liberal Democrats did, but actually how do you thrive on that? And I just think, in my opinion, no political party has figured out how to do coalition as the smaller partner in those arrangements, and to, as I said, avoid being electorally damaged, or indeed using that as a position to, increase support. I don't think anybody's cracked that yet.
No, it was difficult times, but I often reflect at the moment and what we're talking around in current Westminster, that as part of that coalition agreement, there was the referendum on the alternative vote approach, and how, if that had gone a different way, where we might be in the past decade. But we won't reflect on that any longer. I think, when the dust settled and Wales went back to the polls, the Welsh Lib Dems did find themselves in a hole in the Senedd, but I think you were rewarded by your dedication to by being returned as the sole Lib Dem, and but you were able to then push a Lib Dem agenda still, like what you just alluded to in earlier answers, and return to government as Education Minister. And one of the most important posts in government for me, despite being that lone Lib Dem, it was a successful one really for yourself and the party and what you achieved, wasn't it?
Well, it's for others to judge, but personally, I think, considering that we had one single member of that Senedd, we were probably a bit cheeky, really, in being able to enact Liberal Democrat policies, not just in the education sphere, but actually in other parts of the government as well, probably disproportionate to the size of the group, you might say. But it was an opportunity to put into place Liberal Democrat values and Liberal Democrat policies, and I was very fortunate to have had that opportunity. Very fortunate indeed.
I think it's fair to say, one of the big successes, which is just beginning to roll out now, was the new Welsh curriculum, which is a major milestone, I think, of your period as Education Minister. Are you happy with the progress that you're seeing from that now you're not in office?
Oh my goodness. I was very fortunate in that my predecessor was absolutely assiduous and never commenting on education matters when I was the Education Minister. And I promised that when I left office, I would do the same. But I have to say, I'm not in schools like I was anymore, but I'm a parent still with children in the Welsh education system, which does mean that I do, certainly go to my daughter's high school. And when I discussed with the head teacher there, the opportunities for the curriculum, and now when I sit doing some of the other things that I do, and I hear people talk positively about the opportunities the curriculum affords them, then I feel really proud. And I recently met the Three Dads Walking. I don't know if you're aware of their campaign. These are three gentlemen from England who have lost their daughters to suicide. And for the last couple of years, they have been, out walking to highlight suicide and to campaign for suicide awareness to be included in the curriculum. And I recently met them and was able to explain to them about how we have the health and wellbeing AOLE, and we have the whole school approach to mental health in Wales. And I was just so proud to be able to talk to them about that. And they were just bowled over, and they were just like, oh, well, this is exactly, what we've been calling for. So I think there are really, really great opportunities. It's not without its challenges at all, especially, trying to roll out the curriculum with all the challenges that schools face post the pandemic. But I think, there's a real opportunity for the Welsh education system and for those that work in it to be empowered and to be given the professional freedom to teach, a curriculum that is relevant to the children in front of them, and a real opportunity for our children to gain the experiences, the skills and the knowledge to help them be, successful adults. And that's the key to a successful nation, I would argue.
One of your current roles, which you may have alluded to earlier, was your role as chair of the board of Taith, which is the Welsh Government's. I'm going to use some really lazy shorthand. Sorry, it's the Welsh Government's attempt to sort of fill the hole and maybe expand on the opportunities that were previously covered by the European Union Erasmus Plus scheme. The UK government has also got the Turing scheme, which is another sort of attempt at a similar kind of to plug a similar kind of gap. And how was your experience of that scheme been? I appreciate it's very new, but what is the progress that we're making in that regard in Wales, and how have young people reacted to the opportunities?
I'm really proud of the Taith team. When you consider the relatively short timescales that have been involved to go from the idea of Taith and wanting to safeguard and expand upon the opportunities for international education mobility for both students and staff, to the fact that we've got money going out the door to successful projects, I think is a testament to the collective effort in Wales to get the scheme up and running and working. And we've been really pleased with our first core. So Pathway 1 projects, which are traditional forms of education mobility. We've had a fantastic response from all aspects of education. It's really important to note that this covers universities, not just universities as in teaching, but also there's a pot of money for research, because we know international research is really important to our higher education sector, through to youth groups, informal education settings, through to vocational students, adult education. So we've been really, really pleased with the response so far. So if you're listening to this, then please be aware that Pathway 2 applications are open at the moment, and they will be through to the beginning of December. And if you're in further education or vocational education, there is also an opportunity to rebid for Pathway 1. Again, that's open until December. So the programme is up and running. There's a wealth of information and advice out there if you're interested in providing, international opportunities for staff and students.
I'm going to ask a slightly tricky question just to follow up. As I understand it, Taith is funded for the remainder of this Senedd term. What soundings, if any, have you had from the parties that might form future governments in Wales to suggest that a similar type of scheme might continue into the future? Is this something that is going to become a fixture of the Welsh education landscape for some time, or is this something that may last the duration of a Senedd term?
I hope that we make sure that Taith is so successful in this first iteration that it will become untouchable, and that it'll demonstrate its worth to everybody in Wales as something that is really, really valuable to Wales. And that's the challenge to us. It's for us to demonstrate good value for money, for us to demonstrate what these experiences bring to individuals and to the system as a whole. So the challenge is to us, actually, to prove its worth and to make it so successful that nobody would dare suggest bringing it to an end.
I think that brings us on to one of your other hats you wear, Kirsty, on the Wales Constitutional Commission. Could you put in your own words what the aim of the Constitution Commission is?
The way I see the Commission is for a group of people to do all the research, interrogation of evidence, some of the thinking, and then to present to the people of Wales options for their future governance. And options with the upsides and downsides, the pros and cons of all those options laid bare, so that the people of Wales can then for themselves decide how they want to be governed in the future. But they'll be able to make that decision on the basis of evidence and of facts and of clear information without spin.
Have you been surprised by anything which has come forward from the Commission at all? I don't know what your preconceptions of it might have been, but Is there anything come to your attention which you're able to share, which has been of interest?
Well, what's been really interesting is I think that I've been pleasantly surprised by how many people have wanted to give their views. I think sometimes when you embark on an endeavour such as this, quite rightly, the argument is thrown at you, well, there are more important things going on in the world. And certainly in the middle of a cost of living crisis, with war on the European continent, once again, there are many, many, many things in this world that are worrying people. And perhaps constitutional change is very far down the list. But actually, I've been very encouraged by the desire of people to be able to have their say, for good and for bad, and to put their ideas forward, and many of them being very sophisticated in their arguments and about linking constitutional change to the ability or the inability to make a difference in people's lives. So they see the connection. They don't see it's tackling the cost of living crisis versus tackling constitutional change. Actually, they see constitutional change as a way of, being able to make an impact on the very real difficulties that people are experiencing.
You mentioned earlier on that the early days of the National Assembly, the conception of the National Assembly, took place in the context of devolution only moving as fast as the Labour Party is willing to do so, and that the Blair government, when it came in 97, was not chomping at the bit to address constitutional issues after a long period of Conservative rule. And here we are again, potentially or very likely coming to the end of a long period of Conservative rule in Westminster, and a Labour Party looking increasingly like a government in waiting. And much has been made of the Gordon Brown review, that it has been ongoing, and the presentations that have been made to the Labour Party by Gordon Brown, and Mark Drakeford, as First Minister and leader of Welsh Labour, has suggested on a number of occasions that he's had considerable input into those proposals. I was just wondering, what likelihood do you think that a change of government in Westminster would lead to perhaps a greater chance of constitutional change being affected? And I think one of the questions that we've asked James Dodds in the past, I think in the run up to the Senedd election last year, what's the Liberal Democrat prospectus here? The Lib Dems are known for being the only significant federal party on Britain, and is there something similar to the Gordon Brown review within the Liberal Democrat Party? Is that something that the party even thinks about? I think we'd probably be curious to know any and all thoughts you have in that regard.
Well, I'll let James Dodds speak for the Welsh Liberal Democrats, but obviously the Commission has offered the invitation to all political parties in Wales to come forward with their evidence, and I was very pleased that James Dodds and the Welsh Liberal Democrats have taken advantage of the opportunity to do that. I think what's important about the Commission is that it's an opportunity for people in Wales to have their say, because for too often, I think in the past, constitutional change and the debate around it has not been a debate that the Welsh people have had. It's been reactive rather than proactive. It has been kind of not handed to us, but we haven't been active participants in a way that I think citizens should be active participants in the future of their own country. And the Gordon Brown work, I'm sure, is very important and will be important in shaping a certain political party's offer at the next election. But the Commission sits outside of that party political process and is an opportunity for everybody in Wales, regardless of their political persuasion, to be able to have the space and the opportunity to express those views. And I think it's also really important to recognise that I'm interested, of course I am, in relationships between Welsh governments and Westminster governments, but the Commission is also charged in looking at a political culture that I think all of us perhaps would agree that needs attention within Wales as well. So it's not just, I think, a constitutional commission that is looking simply at who does what at which end of the M4, but actually how do you create a really engaging political culture supported by institutions and powers that is one where people, not just in the debate about a commission, but an ongoing basis, feel that they are living in a democracy that is worthwhile participating in. And I think that's just as valuable as the debate about who does what where.
Absolutely the case, and we have a very, 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 very long gestating project about the St David's Day agreement, during which we've spoken to most of, excluding yourself, actually, I'm slightly embarrassed about that. We've spoken to your Lib Dem colleague Mark Williams and many of the MPs and members of the Senedd about that St David's Day agreement, and that, of course, was led entirely by people at the far end of the M4, and certainly, as the stories that have been regaled to us about those discussions, the Welsh Party was sometimes overruled in those circumstances by their colleagues down the other end of the M4. The idea that the people of Wales actually own more of that process inside Wales is actually, quite a revolutionary thought. So I suppose, particularly as you are, I think, approximately 1 year in, and we're expecting an interim report, I should throw the ball to you to be able to knock it back with a pitch for how people who have not yet engaged in the Commission's work should do so.
Well, you're right. Well, we're heading to the point where we are required by the Welsh Government to publish an interim report, and that will happen before Christmas of this year. And that will be a staging post for where we've got to at the moment, but also a jumping off point for the next stage of our work. So absolutely, this is not just a process. Well, if you haven't told us now what you think, that's it. You haven't got the opportunity. There's mechanisms on the website presence to be able to continue to have that dialogue with us. And I think that's what's really important to the Commission, is that for too often, as I said, the constitutional arrangements of Wales have been talked about and decided in other places. And we want the Commission to provide an opportunity for Wales to be at the forefront of those discussions. And I think, also for me, I think, and we'll wait to see whether this happens, it's really important to be able to, as I said earlier, without spin, present potential options, and the advantages and disadvantages, because I think we're all kidding ourselves if we think there is one perfect solution to the answer of how should Wales be governed, and if there was to be in the future, and I'm just guessing, please don't read anything into this, but, if there was to be in the future a referendum on proposals for change, I want people of Wales to be able to engage in that debate on the basis of fact and not on the basis of promises, which undoubtedly the campaigns on either side will make and the accusations that they will throw. And I hope that we can, lay out quite clearly what options there may be, and and the challenges and the advantages of working with those options, so that people know what they're getting into in a way, I would argue, that perhaps people weren't presented with back in the EU referendum.
I'm going to draw us to a close shortly, Kirsty, but I think it's only right and proper that we have a little exploration of Brecon and Radnor while we've got you here. You've served the constituency so well for so long, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are of the future of the constituency. I'm trying to get my head around the boundary commission changes. I wasn't expecting to keep so much and extend into the Swansea Valley, but that's the way we're going. But where do you see the constituency now with all the changes that have happened since Brexit, really?
Gosh, I feel a huge amount of sympathy for future members of that new constituency, because boy oh boy, it is tough to get around Brecon and Radnor as it is. To make it even larger, so my heart goes out to whoever the future representatives of the new boundaries would be, because, as I said, it just makes the constituency even bigger, and it's quite a challenge geographically. Anyway, so we'll wait to see. It's an interesting proposal to go further south. I don't know how the people in the Upper Swansea Valley obviously some of the people in the Upper Swansea Valley are already in the constituency. I'm not sure how they will feel about coming into the constituency, but clearly it potentially changes, some of the make up that constituency, where the balance of influence in that constituency will be historical voting patterns. But yeah, I feel, as I said, I feel a great deal of sympathy for the person that's going to have to get around, because it was a challenge to do it when it was the size it is now, without additional communities coming into it.
Yeah, it's a new name of Brecon, Radnor and Cymru is going to be what we'll be faced with. But there's some interesting proposals, so I'll be interested to see where that goes. And, I'm from that area, and my father doesn't stop telling me that it was a long-term Labour constituency up until boundary changes, which took out a lot of the heads of the valleys communities in the 70s. But I'll bore you with that another time, Rich.
No, it's your father's absolutely right. Tudor Watkins, if you speak to people of a certain age in this constituency and you mention the name Tudor Watkins, people remember him with a huge amount of affection for the work that he did here. And of course, if you go to places like Bryn Mawr, the older generation would probably still describe themselves as being Breconshire people. And of course, they're not part of Breconshire, haven't been part of Breconshire for quite a while. But those memories loom large, and so Tudor Watkins is still venerated here in Brecon and Radnor as an excellent representative.
He is. Which leaves us to my final question is, I don't think Labour will challenge in Brecon, Radnor and Cymru, but we're currently represented in the first past the post seats by two Conservatives. Both we've spoken to on the pod or on various other engagements we've had. Do you think, though, the seats both in Westminster and in the Senedd are likely to come back to the Liberal Democrats in any future elections, Kirsty, or are we still too early from these kind of points to make any kind of judgment?
I think elections in Brecon and Radnor will always be super competitive, because the people of Brecon and Radnor, they get out and vote. And they take those responsibilities really, really seriously. And so I think whatever comes our way in terms of boundary changes, I am sure that habit of going out and voting in BNR will continue, and it'll always be competitive. And that's great, because I think our politics would be stronger if there were more competitive seats right the way across the board. It makes you work harder as a representative, and I think whichever colour you are, I think people who represent Brecon and Radnor understand that.
Well, I think they've got very big shoes to fill, because while you and I are different colour rosette wearers in terms of parties, I fully recognise how good a representative you were for Brecon and Radnor, and I know a lot of people who've appreciated the work you put in over, what was it in total, 22 years?
22 years, so that's all of my 30s and all of my 40s, and even crept into the tail end of my 20s. But can I just say, it was a joy. I mean, don't get me wrong, the times when you feel it wasn't a joy, but for the vast majority of the times, it's a joy. And one of the wonderful things about representing this constituency is the diversity of the community, because I know you're from the border side, are you not? And that's a very different outlook on life and experience of life than if you're over on the west side in communities like Senedd, where you still hear Welsh speaking out on the street, or down in the Swansea Valley in the Abercrabes, on the Cwmtochs, where you hear Welsh speaking in the street, to Knighton and Prestine, where people are much more likely to go to Birmingham than they ever are to come to Cardiff. So it's a fascinating place to represent because of the sheer diversity of the communities. And, we always laugh, don't we, when we say the Powys is different. Gosh, it was like a swear jar. Sometimes I think my colleagues in the Assembly thought, if she gets up again and says Powys is different. But you can't lump Powys all together. Each of their communities are special in their own right. So I was very fortunate. I know more about drainage systems than I ever thought I would know. My mother always wanted me to be a lawyer, and I think maybe I should have taken her advice. A law degree would have been a good grounding. Maybe a degree in social work would have been a good grounding, but it was a joy, and I'm very grateful to the opportunity that the people of Brecon and Radnor gave me, and it became so much more than a job. It's where I got married, and it's where I've raised my family, and it's where I live now. So I'm very fortunate.
Well, Kirsty, thank you very much for the time you spent to speak to us. We do appreciate it. As we close the podcast, I wonder if we could ask you to look forward to the next few years and suggest what you think we might see in Welsh politics, the Liberal Democrats in Wales, and whether we'll see maybe another Kirsty Williams in a parliament or other.
Well, I don't know about that. My mini-me, my middle daughter, keeps threatening me that she might want to pursue a career in Welsh politics, which half of me would be very proud of, half of me fills me with dread. I hope that what we can do is find some way of creating a political culture in Wales which does something to address, which I think for me is the serious problem of ensuring that good people of all political persuasions see politics as an honourable profession. I believe it is still an honourable profession. And I hope that we can see in Wales the development of a culture that means that the electorate trusts those people. And I think for me, that is the biggest challenge facing any political party at the moment, is how can we bridge that gap that now exists, and how can we do something about the polarisation that we find in our society, which I think is something that we've got to engage in, because we've become quite polarised and there is a lack of trust, and we need to do something about that.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly what we at the Hero team are trying to work on. So once again, thank you for your time. We do appreciate it. If people want to hear more about it from you, do you have a preferred social media channel, Twitter or anything like that? They can follow you or get in touch?
Oh, well, they can follow on Twitter. Yeah, it's at Kirsty_Williams. That's what it is.
Thanks for listening to the Hero Pod. If you don't want to miss out, do follow us at Hero Pod on the socials. All of our pods are available in your podcast app of choice. And if you're able to, you can support the pod at www.patreon.com/HeroPod from just £3 a month.
Thank you for listening to Hero. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.